A nobleman in tears, a secret buried in silence. What made the Baron weep? Welcome to Grey Whisper. I am your host, Silas Drex. Let's build this mystery together. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your words bring this channel to life. I always look forward to reading them. Now, let's step into the shadows. It was on a bitterly cold evening in late November that a most peculiar visitor arrived at 221B Baker Street. The fog outside had settled in thick folds upon the cobbled streets of London, coiling around the gas lamps and muffling the clip-clop of horses' hooves. I, Dr. John Watson, had just returned from my rounds and was warming my hands by the fire when Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, her face pale with that curious mix of concern and curiosity that only a most distinguished client could provoke. "He's in a state, Doctor," she whispered. "The sort of state one don't expect from his kind." Holmes did not look up from his chair as the door opened, but his eyes flicked toward me with that feline alertness I had come to know so well. "Our visitor?" he asked. "A nobleman, judging by the coat," I replied, glancing past her, "and quite undone by something." The man who entered was tall, his features chiseled in the haughty tradition of old bloodlines, though now softened by sorrow. His dark eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled despite the heavy wool gloves he removed. He stood uncertainly in the center of the room, as if the force that had brought him here might at any moment change its mind. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked hoarsely. "I am. And you, sir, have been weeping." Holmes rose now, his lean form unfolding with a quiet intensity. "Your right cuff is damp, the silk slightly crumpled, wiped against the eyes more than once. Your boots carry the white residue of a certain clay, found near the canal by Belgravia, and the scent of Turkish tobacco lingers faintly about your coat. You have come from Lord Banbridge's club, where you received disturbing news." The man's face flushed, then blanched entirely. "Dear God," he whispered, "it's true what they say about you." Holmes gave a slight smile. "Pray be seated, sir. You have the advantage of me still." The man sank into the armchair, his fingers clutching the edge of his knee as though to anchor himself to the present. "I am Baron Eustace Delamere of Alvington Square," he said, "and I have come to you because my brother, Lord Edwin Delamere, is missing." "Missing?" I echoed. "Surely a man of his stature." "Huh, he's not merely absent, Doctor," the Baron interrupted. "He has vanished from his own study in the middle of the night, and the door was locked from the inside." Now Holmes's eyes gleamed with a strange light. "You intrigue me, Baron. Continue." Baron Delamere swallowed. "I returned late from a dinner engagement last night. Edwin had gone into his study after supper, as was his habit. His valet, Mr. Keene, knocked at the usual hour of 10 to bring him his evening cordial, but received no answer. The door was locked, the fire still burning within, and a single candle guttered on the sill. We forced the door open, and he was gone." "Gone?" Holmes leaned forward. "No sign of escape?" "None. The window was latched, the chimney too narrow for even a child to slip through, and the study shows no sign of struggle. His coat and walking cane remain, but his signet ring, his watch chain, and, most disturbingly, his blood-stained handkerchief were gone." Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes's fingers steepled under his chin. "And what of the rest of the household?" Holmes asked. "Any peculiar events before the disappearance?" The Baron hesitated, then spoke with reluctance. "There was a noise, heard by the maid, a sound like a man weeping, but deep, terribly deep, almost inhuman. It came from behind the study door, she claims, but when we forced it open, there was only silence." Holmes rose and walked slowly to the window, peering out into the shrouded night as if it might whisper secrets back to him. "Tell me, Baron," he said after a long pause, "when was the last time your brother cried?" Baron Delamere seemed taken aback. "Edwin, not since we were children. Not once in all our years. Have I seen him weep?" Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "Then we shall begin there." Holmes remained at the window long after Baron Delamere had finished speaking, his tall figure silhouetted against the fog-choked lamplight outside. I watched him in silence, knowing better than to disturb the machinery of his mind while it turned. The Baron, meanwhile, sat stiffly, as if afraid that any shift in posture might shatter what little composure he retained. His gloved hands were clenched tightly together, the knuckles white. At last, Holmes turned. "You say the fire was still burning when the door was forced?" "Yes," the Baron replied. "A healthy flame, not long since stoked." "And the candle on the sill?" "Half melted, as if it had burned for perhaps an hour or two." Holmes nodded, already reaching for his coat. "Watson, bring your bag. We are paying a visit to Alvington Square tonight. The fog is thick, but I believe clarity will come not through waiting, but through walking into it." Baron Delamere stood as well, clearly relieved. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I've brought a carriage. It waits outside." The journey through London was slow and silent, the carriage's wheels muffled by the damp streets. Inside, Holmes was lost in thought, his gaze unfocused, though I could tell from the occasional flicker of his fingers that he was working through details already. I ventured a question only once. "You don't believe the Baron's brother simply left the study?" Holmes looked at me with a ghost of a smile. "I believe that a man of Lord Delamere's habits does not vanish on a whim, least of all leaving behind his coat in November. But if the door was locked from the inside, then either Lord Delamere remains in the room in a manner we have yet to perceive, or he left through a path no one else considered possible." The house at Alvington Square loomed out of the mist like a brooding sentinel. It was one of those severe Georgian structures with tall, narrow windows and a quiet dignity to its symmetry. A liveried footman opened the door as we approached, and we were immediately met by the Baron's valet, Keene, a thin man with a narrow face and a nervous blink. "Nothing has been disturbed since last night," Keene assured us as we were led through the entrance hall. "The inspector came this morning, but he found nothing of note. He assumed it was a case of voluntary disappearance?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "And did you believe that, Mr. Keene?" The valet hesitated. My lord was not the type to act impulsively. He was disciplined, private, but not erratic. Holmes said no more as we were shown into the study. The moment we entered, I saw what Keene had meant by undisturbed. The fire had since died to glowing embers, but the room retained its atmosphere, quiet, heavy, and slightly scented with pipe smoke and sandalwood. The furnishings were minimal and tasteful. A high-backed leather chair, a well-worn Persian rug, dark walnut bookshelves reaching the ceiling, and a heavy oak writing desk placed near the window. Holmes circled the room slowly, not with haste, but with the kind of reverence one might reserve for a chapel. He ran a finger along the edge of the desk, bent down to inspect the rug, then paused at the hearth. There, in the ashes, he crouched, removing a pair of tweezers from his pocket. "Watson," he said without turning, "observe." I stepped forward and saw what he held in the tweezers, a burnt sliver of red wax. "A seal?" I asked. He nodded. "Part of one. And yet no sign of a letter or an envelope. Curious." Baron Delamere hovered near the doorway. "My brother often received private correspondence late at night, delivered directly by his manservant. He would read them here and burn them once finished." Holmes smiled thinly. "How convenient. And what of this handkerchief?" Keene produced it from a drawer where it had been placed under Inspector Draycott's supervision. Holmes took it, held it up to the light, then sniffed. "Not blood," he murmured, though it was meant to appear so. "Beetroot juice or a tincture of red dye and vinegar. Elementary deception." The Baron's expression shifted from confusion to indignation. So someone wished to make it appear he had been injured. Precisely. Or more interestingly still, that he wished to give the impression himself. Holmes was now at the window. He undid the latch and opened it a fraction. "Clean." "No," Tampering. And yet, he ran a fingertip along the sill, then held it up. No dust. Someone has opened this recently. I stepped beside him. But it overlooks the garden wall, 12 feet down at least. 13, Holmes corrected absently. And the soil is damp. No footprint. Therefore, if someone left through this window, they left no trace behind. And if they didn't, then this was opened for air, or to send something out. He turned to the room again, his eyes scanning the upper shelves. "Keen," he said suddenly, "have any books been taken from this room since last night?" The valet blinked. "No, sir. His lordship was most particular. Even I wasn't allowed to rearrange them." Holmes climbed the side of one bookcase using a small footstool and extracted a volume from the top row. He opened it, frowned, then replaced it, and withdrew the one beside it. A thin smile curled his lips. "Watson, help me down, will you?" When he was safely back on the ground, he held out the second volume, a thick collection of Dante's Inferno. Inside, between pages 40 and 41, was a folded note, no larger than a calling card. It had no seal. Holmes opened it with care. There was one line, written in a fine and slanted hand. "The hour approaches. The past cannot be locked away." We stared at the note for a long moment. The Baron looked bewildered. "What does it mean?" Holmes handed it to me. "It means, my dear Baron, that your brother was receiving threats or warnings from someone who knew him well. Someone with an interest in history and secrets." "Is that handwriting familiar to you, Baron?" I asked. He took the note and examined it with a trembling hand. Number though it is elegant, almost too elegant. Holmes had returned to the desk, where he now examined the inkwell and the blotting pad. "Your brother kept records?" "Meticulous," said the Baron. "But not here. He kept private journals, one for each year, in his dressing room upstairs. I will wish to see them, but first, this door." He turned toward the study door and ran his hand along the inside of the lock. "The key was in the lock when you found the door?" "Yes," the valet answered. "Turned from the inside. Yet there is no sign of it being forced," Holmes murmured. "No scratch marks, no damage. And yet, gone." He stepped back, eyes gleaming. "Gentlemen, we are not looking for how Lord Delamere left this room. We are looking for how something else may have entered it, something that made a man lock himself in, fake his own injury, and disappear." The Baron swallowed audibly. "But what could do such a thing?" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "That, my dear sir, is what we shall determine. But tonight I shall require quiet and a ladder to inspect the roof outside this window." He turned to me with a glint of familiar excitement. "I believe the game, Watson, is not only afoot, but in full stride." The ladder was found as requested, and with Keen's assistance and a cautious foot, Holmes climbed through the narrow study window and ascended to the flat, lead-tiled roof that lay beyond the garden-facing side of the house. I remained below with Baron Delamere and Keen, my gaze flickering between the dying embers of the hearth and the open window above, half expecting Holmes to call out with some cryptic revelation at any moment. The silence that followed, however, was long and oppressive. At last, I heard the sharp creak of the ladder, and Holmes's boots reappeared, followed shortly by the rest of him. He entered with his usual calm, though his eyes shone with that quiet fervor that always signaled a discovery. "Well?" I asked, unable to restrain my curiosity. He dusted his hands. The tiles bear little in the way of useful markings, though a set of faint depressions in the moss suggests someone lay there recently, perhaps watching the street below or listening to the room through the open chimney flue. "And more interestingly," he added, glancing at the Baron, "there is a broken cornice near the southeast corner. Not enough to suggest entry, but enough to confirm someone, very recently, climbed up or down." The Baron frowned. "But surely one cannot descend from that roof to the street without risk of breaking one's neck." "Indeed. Which makes one wonder, was the visitor coming to see Lord Delamere or to ensure his silence?" We left the study soon after. Holmes requested to see the dressing room where the missing lord kept his journals. Baron Delamere led us up the grand staircase, and I could not help noting how the deeper we moved into the house, the quieter it became, as though each step toward Delamere's private quarters brought with it an additional weight. The dressing room was tidy and austere, much like the study. A large wardrobe, an armchair in dark green velvet, and a narrow writing table were the only real furnishings. Along one wall stood a narrow bookshelf, upon which sat a row of identical leather-bound volumes, each labeled with a year in gilt script. Holmes examined them without touching. "They're arranged chronologically," he murmured. "Good. Which was the most recent?" The Baron approached and pointed. "This one. Ayrte nutre ton nutrimundre." Holmes withdrew it carefully and opened it to the most recent entries. His eyes scanned the pages with swift precision. "March. April," he said softly. The entries grow shorter in May. Sparse by June. Then, nothing after July 17th. 3 months, I said. That's a long silence for a meticulous diarist. Holmes turned back a few pages. "Here, July 10th. Listen to this. The message came again today. Same seal. Same veiled implication. I thought the matter buried 20 years ago, but now it surfaces, with teeth. I must consider what course to take. Confession may be ruin. Silence may be worse." He turned another page. "July 12th. I thought I saw her today, outside the Athenaeum, but it could not have been. She would be, 40? 45. And yet the walk, the hair." I felt the old shame rise again. Another entry. "July 15th. Received the 3rd note. The handwriting is different, but the message the same. The past is a house we never truly vacate. I cannot, will not, be dragged into that darkness again." And finally, "July 17th. I've made inquiries. I've written to Geneva. If the letter is answered, God help me." Holmes closed the journal, his expression unreadable. "Baron Delamere, have you ever heard your brother speak of Geneva?" The Baron looked confused. "Never. He was a man of strict routine, rarely travelled beyond London and the country estate. Did he have any acquaintances from abroad? A French tutor, perhaps, or a foreign business partner?" "None that I know of." Holmes looked to me. "Watson, does this language strike you as odd?" "Extremely," I replied. "It sounds almost like a man on the verge of exposure, a personal failing, something long buried." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. The entries have the tone of a man cornered by memory. Note the reference to shame, and the implication that someone once believed to be gone has returned. This is not merely blackmail. This is a haunting." We returned downstairs where the Baron's housekeeper, a stiff but sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Dray, had laid out tea upon Holmes's request. While he stirred his cup absent-mindedly, he questioned her with polite firmness. "Mrs. Dray, in the weeks before your master's disappearance, did you observe any visitors to the house? Unexpected ones? Perhaps someone who came and left without entering by the front?" She hesitated. "Well, there was one odd occurrence, about 2 weeks ago. A young woman came to the servants' entrance late at night. She asked to see Lord Delamere. Said she had a message from someone called CL or CE, can't quite recall which." "And did she give a name?" "No, sir, but she had a kind of presence about her. Calm, cold. Her clothes were plain, but her manner, well, it unsettled the boy who answered the door. And Lord Delamere. He didn't see her. He was already in his study. But I did hear voices later that night. Soft ones, near the garden." Holmes's fingers drummed the table. "So, we have a mysterious correspondent, or perhaps more than one. A possible female figure from the past. A sealed message burned, and a brother who locks himself in a room only to vanish." "Are you suggesting," said the Baron slowly, "that my brother staged his own disappearance?" Holmes gave him a glance both sharp and sympathetic. "I'm suggesting that your brother, having faced a return of someone or something from his past, sought a way to escape the present, whether that escape was by design or forced. Upon him is what we must now determine." He stood, and we followed. "Come, Watson. There is someone I wish to consult, an archivist at the Athenaeum Club with an uncommonly good memory for names and whispered scandals. If this woman was seen near there, and if Lord Delamere believed he recognized her, then we must begin with the premise that their paths once crossed in those hallowed halls." The Baron stood as well. "And what shall I do, Mr. Holmes?" "Remain here," Holmes said without hesitation. "Do not disturb the study or the dressing room, and above all, if you receive a letter sealed in red wax, do not open it." We stepped into the evening once more. The fog had thickened, curling around the lampposts like smoke from a smothered fire. Holmes walked briskly, his cane tapping the cobblestones with purpose. "I've seen that handwriting before, Watson," he said suddenly as we turned toward Pall Mall. "You have?" I asked, surprised. "Yes. And if I am not mistaken, it once belonged to a certain woman presumed dead some 20 years past. A woman who vanished after a rather public scandal involving forged papers, a duel in France, and the quiet disgrace of a promising diplomat." "Then you believe she's come back?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that she never truly left." We walked in silence the rest of the way, but I noticed Holmes's face had grown tense, his jaw tight with thought. Whatever ghost had returned to haunt Lord Delamere, it was not unfamiliar to Holmes, and if he was right, we were about to uncover a secret long buried beneath the elegance of London's finest names, one that had been waiting in the fog for its moment to strike. The Athenaeum Club was a bastion of quiet intellect, its windows glowing faintly through the mist like lanterns in a fog-bound harbor. Though it was well past the dinner hour, a handful of members lingered in the reading room, their heads bent over volumes of philosophy, politics, and the odd scandalous memoir disguised in dull covers. Holmes and I entered without fanfare, our footsteps softened by thick Persian carpeting as we made our way to the rear of the building. There, in a small side chamber cluttered with card catalogues and bound periodicals, we found Mr. Percival Trent, archivist, gossip collector, and self-professed librarian of whispers. He was a stooped man in his early 60s with a narrow face made narrower by pince-nez spectacles and thinning grey hair parted with mathematical precision. He looked up from a ledger as we entered and blinked once, slowly. "My word, Holmes, a rare honor. And Dr. Watson, of course. I assume something dreadful has happened." Holmes offered a tight smile. "Merely something puzzling, Trent. I require the assistance of your encyclopedic recollections." "I keep them well fed," Trent replied, closing the ledger. "What is the subject?" Holmes withdrew the folded note from his coat, the one retrieved from Lord Delamere's hidden journal, and handed it to him. "The handwriting. Have you seen it before?" Trent took a magnifying lens from his vest pocket and examined the note carefully, lips moving silently as he traced each curve of the script. Elegant, unhurried. And yet there's a pressure in the lower strokes. Determination, perhaps, or suppressed fury." He paused. "I've seen this hand. Many years ago, and not often. It belonged to a woman. Of that I'm sure." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Do you recall a name?" Trent hesitated. "Only a surname. Lemaire, or Leclerc. Something French. She came to the club several times. Always with a chaperone, of course. Though not a member, she was permitted entry by special arrangement. There was a scandal attached, I believe." "Can you recall the nature of it?" I asked. Trent looked uncomfortable. "Only whispers. Nothing ever printed. She was thought to be the companion, or perhaps more, of a diplomat who vanished under mysterious circumstances. There was talk of forged credentials, misappropriated documents. The man fled, the woman disappeared. Some said she drowned in Lake Geneva. Others said she'd been paid to vanish. And the diplomat? Holmes asked. Name of Harrington. Cecil Harrington. He was buried quietly in disgrace, metaphorically speaking. I believe he died shortly thereafter. Some called it suicide, though the Foreign Office called it consumption. Holmes took back the note. And no one has seen this woman since? Not to my knowledge. But then again, she was the sort who could become invisible at will if she chose. We took our leave soon after, and once outside, Holmes lit a cigarette and walked in silence for several minutes. The mist had begun to thin slightly, and the faint silhouette of Big Ben loomed to the east. This woman, Leclerc or Lemaire, I ventured. Do you believe she is the one who visited Lord Delamere? I believe she never left the game, Holmes said quietly. Merely changed the board. If she has resurfaced now, after 2 decades of silence, it means that whatever arrangement kept her quiet has either failed or outlived its usefulness. And Lord Delamere may have been a party to that arrangement, or a victim of it. He turned to me. Come, Watson. There is one more individual we must see tonight. I have a suspicion that Lestrade's office received a letter this morning they failed to mention. We arrived at Scotland Yard just before midnight. The desk sergeant blinked at our arrival, but with Holmes's name and a firm tone, we were soon admitted to Inspector Lestrade's cramped office. The inspector himself was seated behind a stack of reports, his collar slightly askew and a pipe smouldering in the ashtray. I should have known you'd come sniffing round, he muttered as Holmes stepped in. You've got a way of appearing just as things start to twist themselves into knots. Holmes wasted no time. You received a letter this morning. No return address. Red wax seal. Lestrade blinked, then leaned back in his chair. I did. Didn't think much of it. Odd phrasing. Said, the false one returns to the scene of silence. Figured it was some crank. Happens more than you'd expect. Holmes's mouth curved downward. Where is it? Lestrade opened a drawer and withdrew the envelope. Holmes took it, examined the seal, then cracked it open and unfolded the single sheet inside. It read, The past repeats itself not in sound, but in shadow. As once he watched, so now he must run. The Baron weeps, but the shame is not his alone. Holmes exhaled slowly through his nose. She's toying with us, or perhaps with Delamere. There's no direct threat, only illusion, but note the phrasing, as once he watched. That, Watson, is a reference, not to an act, but to a role, a witness. To what? I asked. Holmes's brow furrowed. That is what we must uncover. We returned to Baker Street just after 1 a.m. The fire had long gone out, and Mrs. Hudson had left a covered tray by the hearth. Holmes ignored it. Instead, he went directly to his files, extracting a thick dossier labeled H2L and rifling through it with practiced ease. There, he said, drawing out a yellowed photograph. He handed it to me. It showed a group of men standing on the steps of the British Embassy in Geneva, all dressed in formal suits. But in the corner of the frame stood a single woman, half-turned, her eyes cast toward the camera with cool defiance. The only known image of the woman called Celeste Lemaire, Holmes said. Taken a month before the Harrington scandal. She vanished after that. I studied the face. It was striking, yes, but more than that. It was sharp. Not with beauty, but with intellect. Her expression was not one of coy detachment, but of calculation. She doesn't seem like someone easily silenced, I said. Holmes nodded. Precisely why someone tried. I suspect Lord Delamere knew her well. Perhaps too well. And if she has returned, it is not to haunt him for sport. There was a sudden knock at the door. 3 short raps, quick and firm. Holmes stood instantly, his body taut. I crossed to the door and opened it. Keene stood in the hallway, pale and breathless. Mr. Holmes, forgive the hour. There's been another note. Holmes took the envelope from the valet's trembling hand and opened it. Inside was a single line written in the same hand. "Return to where it was buried. There the truth shall bloom again." And beneath it, something small and strange, a dried violet petal. Holmes held it up to the gaslight. "Viola odorata," he murmured, "a flower associated with remembrance, commonly grown in only one type of London garden." "Which one?" I asked. He met my gaze. "Highgate Cemetery." He turned to Keene. "Tell your master's household we leave before sunrise." And just like that, the past was no longer content to whisper. It was beginning to walk. The eastern sky had only begun to pale as we arrived at Highgate Cemetery, the mist lying low over the graves like a breath held too long. Frost glistened on the wrought iron fences, and the gravel paths cracked softly beneath our boots. The cemetery was deserted, save for the silent statues and crumbling stones watching from their perches, worn smooth by time and London rain. Holmes moved swiftly, his coat drawn tight, eyes sharp and scanning. He had memorized the layout years ago during a different case, something to do with a false burial and an opera singer, if memory served. And now his sense of direction led us deeper toward the oldest section, where the ground was uneven and the stones more ornate. Baron Delamere had joined us at Holmes's insistence, though he said little during the carriage ride, and even less now. His face was drawn, and the red, wax-sealed note he had received just hours before remained clenched in his gloved hand. Holmes had not opened it. "We'll let the scene speak first," he'd said, and the Baron had merely nodded, too worn to protest. We reached a clearing where the path split in two beneath a large yew tree. Holmes paused, kneeling to inspect the ground beneath the branches. The earth there had been disturbed recently. Not dug exactly, but disturbed in a way that only someone with Holmes's eye would notice. A patch of grass pressed flat, scratches on a nearby stone, and at the base of an old angel statue, something gleamed. He reached forward and picked it up, a brass watch fob bearing the Delamere crest. "Curious place to lose such a thing," he murmured, "especially if one was meant to be locked in his study." Baron Delamere stepped forward, staring at the object. "It's Edwin's. No question." Holmes did not respond directly. Instead, he stood and turned in a slow circle, letting his gaze travel from stone to stone. "She wanted us to come here," he said, "and she left a breadcrumb." "Do you think my brother came here of his own will?" the Baron asked. His voice was tight with restrained fear. "I think your brother came to bury something," Holmes replied, "or to retrieve it." He led us a few steps further to a small marble tomb nestled beneath a thicket of brambles. The name carved into the stone was nearly worn away. Georgina Harrington, 1845 to 1872. Holmes bent and brushed the frost from the letters. "The diplomat's sister," I said, realizing it as he did. "Celeste Lemaire was once thought to have forged her letters of introduction to gain access to this family. And more than that," Holmes added. "It was said that she claimed to be Georgina Harrington reborn." Delamere paled. "A lunatic's claim." Holmes's smile was cold. "Or a brilliant maneuver, depending on what she needed at the time." He circled the tomb, stopping at the rear where the ivy had thinned. There, half concealed beneath the roots, was a small iron box, perhaps once black, now flaking with rust. Holmes drew it out gently, and we gathered close as he opened it. Inside were several folded letters bound with faded ribbon, and beneath them an old photograph of Celeste, unmistakably younger, but still bearing that penetrating stare. She was seated beside a man in military uniform. Holmes removed the letters and passed one to me. The script matched the notes we'd seen, but these were far more intimate, rambling, passionate, even poetic in places. "She loved him," I murmured, reading, "or wanted him to think so." Holmes read over another. "They speak of escape, of guilt, and of something witnessed in Geneva, some act that had to be silenced. She calls it the night the false oath was taken. Delamere shifted beside us. What does that mean? Holmes looked up at him. It means your brother, Lord Delamere, was a witness to something he was never supposed to see, and Celeste Lemaire spent 20 years reminding him of it. There was silence then, broken only by the wind in the yews. Holmes gently replaced the letters in the box, but he kept one. This one mentions a ledger, he said, a list of names. They wrote it in blood, she says, and sealed it in ink. But I remember every name. And so do you. Delamere backed away, shaking his head. No, this is madness. But Holmes stepped toward him. Is it? Or is this what your brother was trying to bury? Some guilt, not entirely his, but shared? Something he witnessed and never confessed? Delamere opened his mouth to speak, but the sound that came out was ragged. He was only 18, he said at last. A student. They brought him along for show, because of the family name. But they never thought he'd understand what he saw. Holmes's voice was low. But he did. Delamere nodded. It haunted him. He stopped sleeping. Then, after Harrington died and Celeste disappeared, he seemed to recover. We thought it had passed, but then the letters began. He looked up at Holmes, his eyes wild with the weight of old secrets. She never stopped writing. Holmes turned back toward the tomb. Then she's not finished yet. It was then I noticed something at the edge of the clearing, movement, a figure, cloaked in grey, slipping between the stones beyond the tree line. Holmes saw it too. Without a word, he gave chase, and I followed close behind. Delamere cried out, but we had already vanished into the maze of graves. The figure was fast, moving with an eerie grace that suggested she knew the paths better than we did. Holmes darted between markers, every movement precise, his coat flaring behind him like a shadow. We reached a narrow gate half buried in ivy, and there she was, still a blur in the fog, pausing just long enough to look back. For the briefest moment, her face caught the moonlight. It was her, Celeste Lemaire. Not a ghost, not a memory, a woman alive and watching. Then she was gone. We burst through the gate and into the outer lane, but she had vanished into the mist. Holmes stood there, breathing hard, gaze fixed on the path she had taken. She wanted us to see her, he said, to prove she's no phantom. I caught my breath. And what now? Now, Holmes said, voice low and cold. We wait for her next move. He looked down at the letter still in his hand. She's orchestrating this step by step. She left the petal. She led us to the tomb. And now she's shown herself. She's ready to speak. As we returned to the carriage where Delamere waited pale and shaken, Holmes's mind had already moved forward. She'll make contact again, he said, but it won't be to threaten. I raised a brow. Then why? Holmes folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. Because, Watson, the truth isn't what she wants to reveal. He turned toward me. It's what she wants him to remember. The streets were waking by the time we returned to Baker Street. Milk carts rattled along the cobbles, and the first of the newsboys were beginning their rounds, shouting the day's headlines into the crisp morning air. Holmes removed his coat with practiced indifference, but I noted the stiffness in his shoulders, the intensity in his gaze. He was not yet satisfied. Something was forming behind his eyes, a structure, half-built and still missing its cornerstone. Baron Delamere had been sent back to Alvington Square with strict instructions. No letters opened, no strangers admitted. Though he looked reluctant to leave Holmes's side, he obeyed, his pale features still marked by the face we had glimpsed in the graveyard. Holmes poured himself a small glass of brandy. Not a common indulgence, but one he allowed when a case crept too near to old memories or exhausted the mental sinews he so carefully trained. He did not drink it, merely stared into the dark amber liquid as though it might swirl itself into the answer he was hunting. "She let us see her," I said after some time, speaking quietly. She knew we were there. She wanted to be recognized. Holmes nodded once. Yes, the entire arrangement at Highgate was orchestrated to evoke memory. That violet petal, the hidden letters, the fob left so delicately, every detail was a prompt, but not for us. For Delamere, I realized. "She's pushing him," Holmes murmured. "Forcing recollection. It's not merely revenge she wants. She wants something revealed, or relived." I stood and moved to the fire. "And yet she remains elusive. We've seen her, but we know nothing of where she's staying, who's aiding her, or how she even knew where to find him again." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "That may change. If she's pushing Delamere toward confession, there will be a final move, a confrontation of some kind. She will want him alone, and when she moves again, we will be ready." It was then that the door downstairs opened, and the soft tread of Mrs. Hudson came up the stairs. She knocked once and entered, holding a sealed envelope on a silver tray. "This came by hand, Mr. Holmes," she said, "from the Delamere residence. No postage." Holmes took it, thanked her with a nod, and broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet and a card, plain ivory, unmarked save for an address printed in delicate script. 18 Whistler Lane. Wapping. This evening. No others. The letter was short. "He remembers. He will come. But you must decide whether the truth is your game or your burden." Holmes read it twice, then looked up. She wants a witness after all. The address was unfamiliar to me, but Holmes had already pulled a map from his shelf and traced his finger along the eastern riverside. Whistler Lane, a cluster of derelict houses near the old docks, largely abandoned save for a few tenacious tenants and smugglers too careful to be caught. "Do you suppose it's a trap?" I asked. "Undoubtedly," he said, "but perhaps not in the conventional sense. She's not trying to kill him. If she had, he'd be dead already. No, this is theater, a staged return. She wants something said, and she wants it said there." That evening found us cloaked in heavy wool, walking the damp streets of Wapping beneath the yellow gaslight, our footsteps echoing on the stone. The fog off the Thames hung low and thick, coiling between alleyways and the rotting pilings of warehouses long emptied of cargo. It was the kind of London that existed between eras, half decayed, half silent, utterly watchful. Holmes had insisted we arrive early. "She will expect him just before dusk," he said. "We will be inside before then." 18 Whistler Lane was a narrow 3-story house with boarded lower windows and a rusted knocker that seemed never to have been used. Holmes tried the door. It opened easily. The air inside was cold and stale, heavy with dust. We climbed the stairs quietly, finding a narrow corridor leading to a front room overlooking the street. Holmes gestured for silence and motioned me to crouch behind a tall bookshelf, its contents long gone save for a few mouldy pamphlets. He took the opposite corner, half in shadow. We waited. It was nearly an hour before we heard the carriage, the clip-clop of hooves, muffled wheels. Then silence. Moments later, footsteps on the stairs. Lord Delamere entered the room slowly, as though afraid it might collapse around him. His face was drawn and pale, eyes flickering with something deeper than fear, something closer to penance. He stood in the center of the room, waiting. She came in behind him, unannounced, as if she had always been there. Celeste Lemaire had not changed as much as time might have allowed. Her hair was now streaked with grey, but her posture was erect, her eyes unreadable. She wore no veil, no cloak, only a dark fitted coat and gloves, and in her hand, a small leather-bound book. Delamere turned slowly. Their eyes met. "You remember me," she said softly. "I never forgot." There was no accusation in her tone, only certainty. She stepped closer, holding the book between them. "I kept every word you wrote," she said. "Every line, every lie." Delamere looked down, ashamed. "We were children." "No," she said. "You were the boy who watched them, watched what they did to Harrington, watched them shame me into silence, and then you buried it all beneath titles and inheritance and time." Delamere's hands trembled. "I didn't know. I didn't know they would." She stepped closer. "But you did nothing." "I was afraid," he whispered. She opened the book. Inside, pasted carefully across the pages, were letters, some in her hand, some in his. But also photographs, clippings, documents, evidence. Holmes stirred now, stepping forward, and both of them turned. "Mr. Holmes," she said without surprise, "you've always arrived at the end of things." "Sometimes," Holmes replied. "But not this time." Delamere looked at him, confused. "You knew?" "I suspected," Holmes said, "from the moment I saw the note in your brother's journal, from the mention of Geneva. The name's long buried." Celeste's eyes were on him now. "Then you know why I brought him here." Holmes nodded slowly. "To speak, to tell the truth aloud, for the first time." She turned to Delamere. "You saw them forge the diplomatic reports, saw them alter Harrington's signature. You knew he would be ruined, and when he took his own life, you still said nothing." "I was a boy," Delamere said again hollowly, "and they were my father's friends." Holmes's voice was gentle now. "But you're not a boy now." Celeste extended the book. "This is yours to carry," she said. "If not the guilt, then at least the truth." Delamere took it with shaking hands. No one spoke for a long moment. Outside, the fog thickened. Finally, Holmes stepped toward the door. "Come, Watson." Delamere did not follow, nor did Celeste. As we descended the steps, I looked back once. They stood still in the room, two ghosts bound not by love or hatred, but by memory. The truth at last had been spoken, and in that moment both seemed smaller, mortal. Outside, Holmes lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "The Baron wept," he said softly, "not for guilt, but for what it cost him to finally speak." We walked on into the dark. The lamplight of Wapping faded behind us as we returned to Baker Street beneath a sky swollen with mist and ash. Holmes walked briskly, his long stride clipped and deliberate. I knew better than to interrupt the silence that followed such a confrontation. His mind, though quiet in appearance, was aflame beneath the surface, fitting pieces together, discarding others, and weighing the final angle of truth that still lingered, unresolved. Something remained unspoken, not from Lord Delamere, nor from Celeste, but from Holmes himself. It was not until we reached our sitting room once again, the fire freshly stoked and Mrs. Hudson retreating from our sudden return, that he finally removed his coat and spoke. "She didn't come only for confession, Watson." I looked up from where I was removing my gloves. "No?" Holmes poured a cup of tea, his hands steady, his voice low and even. "She orchestrated this perfectly. Each step, the notes, the symbolic clues, the site of the confrontation. It was theatre, yes, but not just for Delamere. It was a trap of memory for him, but a message to someone else." "To whom?" He paused. "To me." I stared at him, caught off guard by the quiet gravity of his tone. Holmes set the teacup down, untouched. "There was a case, Watson, long before you and I first shared this flat. One buried so deeply in diplomatic silence that no public record remains. I encountered her then. She was not called Celeste Lemaire then, nor did she speak of being Georgina reborn. But it was the same woman. She was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely devoted to one idea, unmasking corruption by becoming part of it. He crossed to the window and looked out into the dark. She worked with a small cabal, former agents and radicals disillusioned by empire. They trafficked in secrets, stolen codes, forged papers, blackmail disguised as conscience, and then she vanished after Harrington's disgrace. I believed she had been silenced. He turned now, eyes shadowed but focused. But she wasn't. She merely waited. I digested this quietly. Do you believe she intends to publish the book she gave Delamere? Holmes gave a brief shake of his head. Number, that book wasn't a weapon. It was a ledger of memory. She wanted him to carry the burden of truth, not to destroy him, but to restore balance, to force him to become what he had once refused to be, a witness who speaks. And now? Now, Holmes said, the question becomes, was that her final move? Or is there one piece still in motion? The answer came faster than either of us expected. It was the knock at the door, 2 soft raps, almost too delicate to be heard. Holmes was already halfway down the stairs before I could speak, and by the time I joined him, the door was swinging wide. So outside stood a boy, not more than 10, barefoot despite the chill. In his hand, a parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with red string. He offered it without a word. Holmes crouched to the boy's height. "Who gave you this?" "She said you'd know," the boy replied. "Said to give it to the tall man with the glass eyes." Holmes allowed the faintest twitch of a smile. "That sounds like her." He handed the boy a coin and sent him off before examining the package. We brought it inside and unwrapped it on the desk. Within was a slim bundle of papers and a photograph. I leaned in. The photograph was new, taken perhaps only days ago. It showed the interior of a drawing room, unfamiliar to me. At its center sat Lord Delamere, hunched in the same coat we had seen him wear the night before, his face weary and sunken. Across from him, Celeste. Not speaking, just sitting, watching. The image was eerie, not because of its composition, but because of what it implied. Someone else had taken it. Beneath it, a letter in her unmistakable hand. Truth, once freed, demands continuity. He has spoken to me, and in doing so, buried what we once were. I ask only this. If they come for him, as they once came for Harrington, do not let them silence him again. Holmes read it aloud, then folded the paper slowly. "She's leaving," he said. "Fleeing London?" He nodded. She never intended to remain once the truth had been passed. Her part is done. She's given him a voice at last. But she knows what follows confession in such circles. I frowned. Reprisal. Holmes nodded grimly. There are still men, high ones, who remember Geneva, who remember the ledger, and if they sense he has spoken to anyone beyond her, they will move to erase it all. What do we do? Holmes looked at me, and I saw then a rare glint. Not fear, but responsibility. We protect him, and we preempt them. The rest of the day passed in grim preparation. Holmes sent word to an old acquaintance in the Foreign Office, a man named O'Rourke, half spy, half bureaucrat, who owed Holmes several debts of the sort that carried weight. Discreet protection was arranged for Lord Delamere under the pretense of a sudden diplomatic illness. A trusted barrister was briefed to receive the ledger if anything were to happen to either Holmes or the Baron. By dusk, the machinery was in place. But it was the arrival of Inspector Lestrade that marked the turning of the tide. He came unannounced, cap in hand, with a face like granite and a thin folder in his grasp. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, stepping inside. "I assume you've heard?" "Heard what?" Holmes asked evenly. Lestrade opened the folder. Inside was a telegram. Body recovered from canal near Wapping. Unidentified female. Drowned, no belongings. Cause, suspicious. I felt the air leave the room. Holmes stared at the telegram for a long time, then closed the folder and handed it back. "It's not her," he said flatly. Lestrade looked surprised. "How can you be sure?" "Because she's never where you expect her to be." But his voice had gone quieter now, less certain. That night, Holmes sat by the fire, unmoving. His violin rested untouched beside the hearth, and the brandy remained sealed on the shelf. I sat nearby, watching the firelight flicker in the glass pane. "She may be dead," I said softly. "She may," he replied. "And if she is?" Holmes turned, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that I rarely saw. Grief, not for a woman, but for the game unfinished, the mind that had matched his own, and the cost of truths dragged from the deep. "If she is," he said, "then she died knowing what most never do." I waited. She won. The fire crackled on, and the shadows stretched quietly over Baker Street. Morning arrived grey and listless, its wan light filtering through the fogged windows of Baker Street as though reluctant to wake the world. Holmes had not slept. I had left him by the fire sometime after 3, and when I returned to the sitting room just past 7, he was still there, eyes open, body still, the tips of his fingers pressed together beneath his chin in a posture of deep contemplation. The silence was heavy. He did not look up as I crossed to the window and opened the curtains to a damp and unimpressive dawn. "There's a certain stillness to the air when an enemy vanishes," he said softly, as though continuing a conversation already in motion. "But stillness is not peace. It is only the echo after a bell has rung." I turned. "You believe she's truly gone, then?" "I believe," he said, "that if she is dead, it is not by accident." He rose slowly, his body moving with a deliberation that came only when the mind outpaced the limbs. He crossed to his desk and unrolled the photograph Celeste had sent the night before. The final message. Delamere seated, broken, her face in shadow. No timestamp, no location details beyond what we had inferred. Holmes ran his finger across the edges, pausing at the corner where a tiny crease had formed. "She staged every moment of this, Watson. She chose her final appearance, her final correspondence, and her parting note with meticulous care. This image wasn't taken by an accomplice, as we assumed." I frowned. "You believe she used a timer?" "I believe she planned for the image to exist exactly as we received it, untraceable, but suggestive. Look at the light source," he pointed, "from the right. Daylight through sheer curtains. The softness of the shadow suggests late afternoon. There's a reflection here, barely visible, on the teacup beside Delamere. That's a window, and beyond it, a structure I recognize. The edge of the old Tate warehouse near Vauxhall." He turned sharply, already reaching for the map in the cabinet. "That building was converted 6 months ago into a private boarding house. 10 rooms, no registry. It's used discreetly by certain individuals who wish to pass through London unseen." He found the location and jabbed a finger at the map. "There, that's where she brought him. And if she's dead, then someone else found her afterward, someone who knew exactly where to look." We left within the hour, traveling by cab through the dull grey of morning traffic, until the Tate building rose into view. Cleaner now than in its shipping days, but still bearing the bones of its past. Holmes instructed the driver to wait a block away, and we approached on foot, slipping through the narrow alley behind the east-facing side. A rusted fire door led to a corridor smelling of varnish and dust. A boy of perhaps 16 sat in a folding chair by the rear stairwell, reading a tattered novel and pretending not to notice us until Holmes addressed him directly. "Room 9, Holmes said simply. The boy hesitated. "I'm not supposed to—" Holmes produced a half-sovereign, then a second. The boy's eyes widened. "She checked out yesterday," he said. "Morning, paid in cash. No luggage. Anyone come after her?" The boy looked away. "A man. Sharp suit. Didn't give a name. Just showed a paper and I let him up." He left 15 minutes later. Didn't say anything. Holmes nodded once. "Show us the room." The boy obeyed, leading us up the narrow stairwell and down a hall lined with dark wood and peeling wallpaper. Room 9 sat at the end. Holmes tried the handle. Unlocked. The boy faded back down the corridor, clearly uninterested in witnessing anything more. The room was small but tidy. A single bed, a writing desk, and a wardrobe too narrow to be of use. Holmes moved through it quickly, methodically, as though he had already walked it in his mind. "She left no trace," he murmured. "No hair, no cloth fibers, no scent of perfume or powder. Every trace of her presence has been erased." I stood by the desk. She meant to disappear. Or she meant someone else to believe she had. Holmes's voice darkened. "This has the feel not of death, but of erasure." He opened the desk drawer, and there it was, a single piece of paper, folded with precision, lying in the center like a tombstone. Holmes unfolded it. We read it together. "To vanish is not to surrender. It is to deny the hand that tries to claim you. There are still names unspoken, still acts unseen. He is not the only one who remembers. Be ready." It was unsigned. Holmes turned the page over. No watermark, heavy stock, commercial. Sourced in France. He stared at it for several seconds more, then slowly slid it into his coat. "She's alive," I said, though it was more a question than a certainty. "I believe so," Holmes said. "But she is no longer in London." He moved to the window, looking out across the rooftops of Vauxhall, his voice quiet. "She's passed the flame to someone else." We returned to Baker Street by foot, the streets growing noisier now with carts, vendors, and the rising rhythm of the day. Holmes was silent until we reached the doorstep, where he paused, his hand on the rail. "There's a philosophy," he said suddenly, "in chess, that the most dangerous piece is not the one in motion, but the one no one sees move. She has become that piece." Inside, Lestrade waited. He stood in the sitting room, arms folded, his hat still in hand. "We pulled the body," he said without greeting. "Female, mid-40s, dressed plainly, but there's no certainty it's her." Holmes sat. "Face? Unrecognizable, river damage, but there's a ring, silver, inscribed on the inner band." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And?" Lestrade unfolded a slip of paper and read, "To CL. May no truth be buried too deep." Dated 1872. We all went still. "She wanted us to find it," Holmes said finally, "but not to prove she was dead, to remind us she isn't done." He rose and crossed to the desk, taking the final photograph once more in hand. Then the ledger Celeste had left Delamere. Then, slowly, the first note, the one that had started this entire chain of events. He spread them across the desk like cards in a tarot spread. Every move she made was deliberate, every message symbolic, and yet she left no threats, only truths, measured, curated. He turned to me, his gaze sharp now. "This isn't the end, Watson. This is a warning." I nodded. "So what do we do?" Holmes's mouth curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. "We wait. And we watch. The game continues." Outside, the bells of St. Mary's tolled midday. Inside, in the quiet of 221B, Sherlock Holmes sat back, lit a match, and watched the flame bloom in his fingers. Small, defiant, and far from finished. The day that followed was one of silence and shadows. Outside the windows of 221B Baker Street, London went about its usual routines. Newspapers delivered, cab wheels churning up the grit of recent rain, and market vendors shouting over the clamor of carts. Inside, however, the rhythm was slower, more deliberate. Holmes remained seated at the corner desk most of the morning, not writing, not speaking, but simply staring at the array of documents and artifacts spread before him. He had arranged them like a constellation. The photograph, the violet petal now pressed between glass, the handwritten notes, the inscribed ring from the river body, and finally the sealed ledger that still bore Lord Delamere's family crest. Each piece, when viewed separately, offered a sliver of meaning. But it was their arrangement that concerned him now, what they suggested when seen together, and what remained conspicuously absent. I watched him with the familiarity of long habit. I'd seen Holmes in this mode before, silent, unmoving, as if in a trance. But today there was something more subdued beneath his focus, not distraction, but gravity. I had not seen that look since the Moriarty affair, when a case took on weight beyond mere intellect, when it became personal. By early afternoon, he finally stirred, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the desk. "She left a trail designed not for discovery, but for resonance," he said without turning. "Each artifact connects to a memory, not just for Delamere, or even for me, but for the structure itself, the scaffolding she built to contain the truth. But she left a flaw." I stepped closer. "A flaw?" She vanished too cleanly. He turned now, eyes sharp. "A woman who spent 20 years living in the folds of Europe's secrets does not drown with a ring on her hand unless she wishes to be found. But the ring, the message, the body itself, it's too precise, too theatrical." "Then you still believe she's alive?" Holmes shook his head. "I believe she anticipated death. Whether by her own hand or another's, I cannot say. But she planned for it, which means she also planned for what comes after." A knock at the door interrupted us. I crossed the room and opened it to find a young courier, barely 20, red-cheeked and rain-dampened, holding a small parcel addressed in unfamiliar script. He handed it over with a nod and was gone before I could question him. Holmes took the parcel and examined it without opening it. Different hand. Male. Left-leaning slant. Nervous pressure. This was written recently, and in haste. He slit the wax seal with his knife and removed a single sheet of paper. It read, "She knew the time was short. Told me to wait until I saw the name in the paper. You're the one she trusted. Said if anyone could finish it, you could. The rest is below the floor. Room 12, Blackhall House." Beneath the note, folded in waxed paper, was a key, simple, rusted at the edges. Holmes held it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "Blackhall House," he repeated quietly. "An address known to only a few. It was used by a network of operatives in the 80s, a safe house for those caught between sides." He was already standing, coat in hand. We reached Blackhall House by mid-afternoon. It stood at the edge of Lambeth, tucked behind a former tannery, surrounded by rows of tenement buildings and low smoke. The house itself had once been stately, a Georgian manor now reduced to peeling paint, broken shutters, and the occasional smashed pane. Its windows stared blindly out toward the river, its gutters overrun with moss. Inside, it was worse. The ground floor had collapsed in places. The wallpaper hung in sagging strips, and the only sign of life came from the scent of burned wood, a fireplace used recently. Room 12 was on the second floor, its door barely hanging on one hinge. Holmes entered first, sweeping the lantern beam across the decaying interior. The room was empty, save for a broken chair and an overturned crate. He knelt immediately, sweeping away debris with the flat of his palm until his fingers found the edge of a loose floorboard. With care, he used the knife to pry it free. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather folio bound with red twine. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside were papers, dozens of them, letters, ledgers, official forms bearing government insignias that had been quietly retired. Memoranda between men whose names I recognized from distant, buried scandals. Some marked destroyed, not to be, filed all intact. "She kept everything," I whispered. "Not everything," Holmes murmured. "Only the parts that mattered." He held one paper up to the light. It was a ledger of names. 15 in total. The final entry was dated July 19th, 1872, and at the top, under the word witness, was one name: Edwin Delamere. We sat in silence for several moments. She was preparing for this even then, Holmes said. Before she vanished, before Delamere knew he would be found. This was never about vengeance. It was about insurance. I studied the entries beside him. If these documents become public, they would destroy careers, perhaps entire families. They already destroyed one, Holmes said. Hers. He folded the papers and replaced them in the folio, his motions precise. We can't give this to Scotland Yard. Too many conflicts, too many connections. Then what do you plan to do with it? Holmes paused. I plan to let it breathe. We returned to Baker Street in the falling dark, the city casting long shadows as gas lamps blinked to life. Holmes spent the evening writing, not his usual sparse notations, but letters, 3 in total, each one sealed with wax and addressed to recipients whose names he would not reveal. He handed them to me without comment. Should I post them tonight? No, he said. Deliver them by hand, one to the Ministry of the Interior, one to the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, and the third to O'Rourke. I hesitated. And what will they do? He met my eyes. What they must. The truth is not a weapon, Watson, it is a light. But light burns as well as it reveals. That night, as I returned from my errands, I found Holmes at the window once again, staring into the London mist. Do you believe she's watching? I asked. Holmes didn't turn. I believe she always knew how to disappear, but she also knew how to endure. And Delamere, he'll survive, but he will never again be silent. I stood beside him in the stillness, the sounds of the city fading into distance. The case was over, but its echoes would linger, on the page, in the ledger, and in the unspoken spaces where names like hers were never meant to be remembered. But now they would be. 2 days passed in an uneasy quiet. Holmes kept the flat almost entirely, save for one early morning excursion of which he told me nothing, returning before breakfast with boots muddy and coat damp from fog. He didn't speak of what he had done, nor did I ask. His face bore that clipped stillness I had come to associate not with resolution, but with the anticipation of a final shift, a piece still waiting to fall into place. The city around us moved on, oblivious. A scandal at the docks, a minister accused of impropriety in the House, whispers of another flu wave creeping down from the north. But nowhere in the Gazette, the Times, or even the more daring Observer did the names from Celeste's ledger appear. The storm she had prepared had not yet arrived. Holmes had cast his stones, letters delivered, truths entrusted to hands steadier than mine. But London's great machinery of silence had not yet decided whether to absorb them or let them ring out. It was on the third morning, shortly after 10, that the bell rang, followed by a knock, 2 firm raps, and then one soft. Holmes stood immediately. "That's O'Rourke," he said, already crossing the room. The man who entered a moment later was tall, spare, and wrapped in a coat that bore the vague tailoring of government. Unremarkable to the average man, but unmistakable to one who knew how influence dressed when it wished to go unseen. His eyes were alert but not hostile, his expression worn by long experience. He greeted Holmes with a nod and then me, though I could see he had no desire for company. "Dr. Watson may remain," Holmes said evenly. "He already knows what must be known." O'Rourke said nothing for a moment, then drew a sealed folder from within his coat and set it on the desk. "I've read it all," he said. "Every name, every signature. The ones who are still in London, there are 6. 3 of them hold chairs. 1 has a hereditary seat. 2 others are ghosts, but with long shadows." "And the boy?" Holmes asked. Delamere's safe. He'll be called to testify if it comes to that. But for now, he's under quiet protection. Holmes leaned back slightly. So you believe the material is legitimate? O'Rourke gave a faint, bitter smile. I know it is. I was a clerk at the time of Geneva. I saw the clean-up orders. Watson and I exchanged a glance. You were part of it? I asked carefully. I was 23, O'Rourke replied, and silent, like most boys trained not to ask questions. He turned back to Holmes. There will be no public reckoning. Not the way she hoped. Not in full. But pressure is being applied. Names are being withdrawn from ballots. Funds are being cut. One has left the country already. They're circling wagons, but the center is crumbling. Quietly. Holmes gave no reaction, only folded his hands. She knew this would be the shape of justice, he said. Not thunder, only erosion. O'Rourke nodded. But even erosion changes the landscape. He hesitated, then added, the woman, Celeste, or whatever name she used when you knew her. We've confirmed she reached Calais, left under the identity of a governess from Liège. The ring in the river wasn't hers. I felt a tension release in the room, though Holmes didn't exhale. He only nodded once, slowly. She won't be seen again, O'Rourke said, but she will be remembered. Holmes offered his hand then, an uncharacteristic gesture, and O'Rourke took it. I'll keep the original folio under guard, the man added, and the copy in Geneva, just in case. And with that, he left. The silence he left behind was not heavy, but reflective, like the fading warmth after a fire goes out. Holmes remained standing, looking out the window again, watching the flow of carriages and coats below. She never intended to survive this, he said after some time, only to ensure the story did. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Later that afternoon, a package arrived. Small, unmarked, wrapped in soft brown paper and tied with twine. Holmes opened it without expression. Inside was a single page from the Illustrated London News, folded neatly. The headline was about a diplomatic transfer in Brussels. The rest of the page was mundane: agricultural trade updates, the construction of a railway bridge in Kent. But nestled within the fold was a violet petal, and beneath it, in the margin of the newspaper, 5 words in the familiar hand. The ledger is never closed. Holmes placed it on the mantel, between his Stradivarius and the Persian slipper that held his tobacco. He did not speak of it again. That evening I found him writing in his journal, not his usual monograph-style entries, but something longer, a letter, perhaps, or a record. When he was done, he sealed it and slid it into the drawer marked private. I sat across from him, the fire low. She still haunts you, I said quietly. Holmes looked up, his eyes not cold, but removed. No, he said. She challenges me. He rose then and poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to me. To unfinished truths, he said, lifting the glass, and I raised mine in answer, to those who dare to finish them. Outside, London turned its lamps against the dark. Somewhere, perhaps in Calais, or Paris, or farther still, a woman moved silently through history, erased from record, but not from consequence. And in a drawer in Baker Street, her story rested, unfinished. Yes, but unforgotten. The game was over. And yet even then I knew Sherlock Holmes would be watching the board. It was nearly a fortnight later when the final thread came quietly undone. A letter arrived addressed in a hand neither Holmes nor I recognized, firm, angular, with a slight continental influence. The envelope bore no return address. Inside was a single sheet, cream-colored, folded once. Holmes read it in silence, then passed it to me. You were never meant to finish the story, only to recognize that it had begun again. Another has taken the ledger. The names will resurface, not because of what was buried, but because of who will dig. Thank you for the light. There was no signature. Only, tucked within the crease, a second petal. This one not violet, but white heather, a highland bloom, a symbol, I later learned, of protection and fortitude. Holmes set the letter aside without comment and crossed to the window where Baker Street unfolded beneath us, familiar and distant at once. He remained there a long time, unmoving, and I knew he was turning over every moment, not for loose ends, but for what might come next, for what might be required of him in the echo of truth. The events surrounding Lord Delamere were never made public. O'Rourke's efforts ensured a slow, quiet unseating of those implicated in Celeste's papers. None were prosecuted, none vanished spectacularly, but their names no longer held the same power in Parliament or the clubs of Mayfair. Invitations ceased, honours were deferred, their influence drained away in silence, just as she had intended. As for Delamere, he withdrew from society not out of disgrace, but of choice. The man who once inhabited the pages of Tatler and Debrett's now lived in quiet exile in a small house near the southern coast. He took with him no staff, no titles, and, I was told, only one object of importance, the ledger. His own testimony, quietly submitted to the appropriate parties, proved instrumental in validating the rest. But he never spoke of it publicly, nor was he ever asked to. In the weeks that followed, Holmes resumed his habits, papers in the morning, a case or two of ordinary variety, violin at night. But the matter of Celeste Lemaire, or Georgina, or whatever truth she carried within her name, was never far from his thoughts. I saw it in the pauses between cases, in the way his fingers lingered on old folders, and in the quiet glance he gave the violet petals still framed upon our mantel. And then, one evening, months after the last letter, Holmes surprised me. We had just finished dinner when he returned to the fire with a notebook, his personal journal, and placed it in my hands. "I've written it down," he said quietly. "The case. Every detail." I looked at him. "For publication?" "No," he replied. "For preservation, in case it is needed again, or in case someone, somewhere, dares to finish what she began. And if they come for it, they won't find it here." And indeed they didn't. I would later discover that he had arranged for the notebook to be stored in a vault in Zurich, under a false name in a sealed envelope, only to be opened under precise instructions. Insurance, he called it. But I believe it was something more. A tribute. To a woman who had bested power not with violence, but with persistence, with memory, with truth sharpened to a razor's edge. In time, other cases would come and go. Mysteries more flamboyant, more tragic, some with higher bodies and louder headlines. But none with the quiet, haunting weight of the night the Baron wept. For in that single night, Holmes confronted not a criminal, but a reckoning wrapped in fog, forgotten names, and a woman's long-held silence. Years later, when Holmes had retreated to Sussex, and I came across that photograph once more, Delamere, broken, Celeste, unreadable, I found myself thinking of her last words. The ledger is never closed. No, I thought, it never is. But it is watched, and somewhere, whether in Calais, Geneva, or the memory of those who dared to carry it forward, the truth endures. And Sherlock Holmes, always and ever, endures with it, 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 endures with it.